Mary Miller, hi.
Hi, Tamara. Bruce Gump.
I think okay.
I wonder who the council is.
Oh, I don't know.
Pardon?
Yes, please.
Sure, that'd be great. Yeah,
That'd be great.
We're
Thank
getting
you.
a collection. That'd be super. Thanks, Tamara. Yeah. There's been so many of them.
Tamara.
Oh, she probably has it.
I know. Thank you. Then she can email me. I mean, we know how trustworthy Mr. Rose is.
Staunchly.
First witnesses. And how we doing on time?
Yeah, right on
So
time.
I see 5 cameras back there.
No,
5 cameras. And I know Michael back there.
go to the,
Wonderful.
what's that?
Okay.
Usually we have a staff or say.
Excellent.
No to Chairman Micah, I think. But, oh, yeah, it might have been.
Good morning. I'd like to call this hearing of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and the Subcommittee on Government Operations to order. We're conducting this morning a field hearing of our subcommittee. The hearing title today is the Delphi Pension Bailout, Unequal Treatment of Retirees. Pleased to be in Dayton today, and we are here at the request of Congressman Turner. The order of business will be as follows. I'll start with some opening statements myself, Mr. Turner, and we will leave the record open for other members who want their statements to be made part of the record. Today we'll hear, after the opening statements, from 2 panels of witnesses, and we will have each of them give their testimony, and then we will allow for questions after we've completed the members of panel with their testimony. So first of all, I want to thank Mr. Turner for his untiring support on behalf of the Delphi pensioners who were treated unfairly, and again, calling this matter to my attention. I've took over the chairmanship of the Government Operations Subcommittee. I'm the senior member of the panel. Some of you may have seen lately some of the work Mr. Turner, myself, Mr. Issa are involved in, a number of high-profile matters before the Congress, and we are the chief investigative panel in Congress, so it's our responsibility, whether they're big issues or issues like the Delphi pension issue that affects thousands of retirees. They all deserve our attention, and that's the purpose of this hearing today. I will say also that I want to thank Sinclair Community College for hosting this. Just met President Johnson. Have a remote attachment to the community college. I found out that Sinclair has an association with 2 Florida community colleges, one Santa Fe and Gainesville, and then my alma mater, the Miami-Dade Community College, which I graduated from. Very proud of the work of community colleges and the opportunity they give so many people like myself and others. So again, we're pleased to be here, and we will proceed. We'll start with my opening statement. I have sort of a general comment that usually give at these hearings that to explain the purpose of government oversight, government reform panel, is explaining to folks that we exist for two fundamental purposes. First, Americans have a right to know that money Washington takes from them is well and justly expended. And second, that Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty and responsibility on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold the government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know exactly what they've got from their government and where their government must be held responsible. We must work tirelessly to, and in a bipartisan fashion, and also with a partnership with citizen watchdog groups to deliver the facts to the American people and bring reform and justice and fairness to the American people and hold the federal bureaucracy accountable. So that's the mission of our committee in general. As to this specific hearing today, again, this is a continuation of the committee's efforts to learn how and why salaried Delphi retirees saw their pensions cut as a result of decisions made by the Treasury Department and the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. Again, we wouldn't be here without the untiring commitment and dedication of your congressman, who has been sort of like a pit bull on this and has not let it go, and again brought this to my attention. I got through reading some of these volumes and others of background, and immediately said to him that a great injustice is done to the people that he represents. So I know we will not stop until we pursue the truth, get the facts. Some of that has not been uncovered to date, and that's the purpose of this hearing. And we're not going to stop until Delphi retirees get the justice they deserve. The facts and circumstances about why we're here bear repeating. Delphi, and let me say this again for the record, separated, as we know, from GM and became an independent company in 1999. At that point in time, a separation agreement allowed for unionized Delphi employees to secure a guarantee from GM that in the event of a Delphi bankruptcy, GM would top up, that is, make whole the remainder of pensions not covered by the Pension Guarantee Fund. In fact, no such agreement was made for the salaried employees. As such, when the Delphi plans were terminated in 2009, the salaried retirees faced immense hardship and lost health coverage and other benefits, dramatically disrupting their lives and their plans for retirement, while unionized employees maintain full pensions and benefits. And today we'll hear from some of those so affected. In addition to the financial hardship, non-unionized Delphi retirees feel betrayed by their government. This is a government program. This is government money, taxpayer money, and it picked winners and losers and did so in an unjust fashion. While the unions were heavily involved in the negotiations surrounding the bankruptcies in GM and Delphi, the salaried employees did not have a seat at the table, and in fact were left in the dark because of the fact that the administration did not deem them a politically favored class. The whole mess could have been avoided were GM to pursue a traditional bankruptcy route and not be subject to the political whims of the Obama administration. A traditional bankruptcy route would have been better for GM in the long run and would have mitigated the risk of a politicized decision-making process, such as what actually occurred with the Delphi salaried retiree pensions. The bankruptcy proceedings that occurred were simply a legal vehicle for delivering ownership shares to the auto companies to the government. In other words, in the words of one legal scholar, instead of a traditional bankruptcy, that quote was the Obama administration, working with the automakers, patched together a process without precedent, a bankruptcy combined with a bailout incorporating the worst elements of both. Issues surrounding why the pension fund for Delphi salary retirees was terminated are extraordinarily complex. At the request of members of Congress, the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, we are conducting an audit of this issue. This report is set to be released in the near future and should provide more insight into decisions made by the Treasury Department and the Pension Guarantee Fund relating to Delphi. So with those comments, let me say that, again, I strongly believe, after reviewing the record information that's provided to me, that great unfairness exists, that the government did, in fact, pick winners and losers unfairly, that in this government bailout, they used government money. They also used government entities in making those decisions, and I believe that they did so in an improper fashion. One of the things that I don't know is what took place in some of those proceedings. Talked to Mr. Turner last night, and I intend, if necessary, we will subpoena those records, and we will get the facts of who made what decisions on what basis and what transpired. And again, I think based on what I've seen, the unfairness was very calculated, and that we should find some way to make these retirees whole. In addition to issuing subpoenas, as I said, if necessary, to get those documents they've been requested and not been provided to the committee or Congress prior to my becoming the chair of the subcommittee. Second thing we will do is we will hold as many hearings as necessary. This one is here, and we'll also hold them in Washington until we do get the facts. And I think we also need to carefully review the findings of the Inspector General audit report that's coming out. So with those comments and with that agenda in mind to proceed on this issue, I'm now pleased to yield to gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several people, obviously, to thank. First, I would like to thank St. Clair Community College for hosting us, and secondly, I would like to thank the Delphi salary retirees themselves. Mr. Chairman, as you know from all the materials that you have reviewed in preparation for this hearing, were it not for the Delphi salary retirees standing up against the injustice which they faced, organizing themselves in a great structure and filing suit, pursuing the judicial process through this, and working as a partner with us, we would not know the details that we know today of what occurred in the process of the administration picking winners and losers and resulting in the Delphi salary retirees losing a great portion of their retirement benefits. Mr. Chairman, as you and I discussed last night, it was my intention, after hosting this hearing, to approach you to ask for further follow-on hearings in Washington after this hearing, and for support, if need be, for issuing subpoenas since the administration has not been forthcoming. I want you all to know in attendance that as a result of your great work and the record that the chairman was able to review, we didn't have to wait until this hearing was over. That the chairman, when I had dinner with him last night, had reviewed the materials, and he says, well, I've looked at this, and it looks like we need some follow-on hearings in Washington, D.C., and if need be, we should issue subpoenas. So if you would all join me in thanking the chairman both for being here. And Mr. Chairman, that doesn't mean we don't need to have this hearing, but it does mean we greatly appreciate the fact that you are dedicated to this issue, the work that you've done in the preparation for today, and your commitment to addressing the issue of injustice. Mr. Chairman, before we proceed, I have several statements for the record from other members of Congress that could not be here with us today, and I ask for unanimous consent for those to be entered.
Without objection, so ordered.
I would also like to point out that we have here with us today staff from the offices of Congresswoman Susan Brooks and Senator Rob Portman, both of which have been excellent partners on this issue. And as members of the Government Reform and Oversight Committee, as the chairman says, we are dedicated to the issue of trying to do investigations to right injustices. As you know, our committee is very active in the issues of Benghazi, the IRS, and other issues that appear to be scandals where the administration has overstepped what our concept is for justice and protection of our own liberties. And this injustice in what has occurred with the Delphi Sauer retirees is one that needs to be remedied. Mr. Chairman, the Dayton region was the birthplace of the Delphi Corporation. The company was founded as the Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, which evolved through the hard work of Ohioans into Delco, which was a division of General Motors. General Motors subsequently spun off Delphi Corporation, which at one point was the largest part suppliers to General Motors. My father worked for General Motors for over 40 years in this town. When Delphi declared bankruptcy in 2005, the company decided to close or sell several facilities in Ohio. Here in my district, 2 facilities in Dayton, as well as facilities in Kettering, Moraine, and Vandalia, were closed. The effect of these plant closures have been felt throughout the Dayton region, as many of our family members, neighbors, and friends were Delphi employees. Whole neighborhoods have been affected by Delphi's bankruptcy, and it is appropriate that we are right here in Dayton to hear directly from the retirees here in this community. In the wake of the General Motors bailout, the administration picked winners and losers. There's no other way to say it. Without transparency, without justification, and in my opinion, without respect for the men and women who dedicated years of service in earning their retirement benefits. The treatment of salaried retirees is particularly troubling in comparison to the benefits received by some in organized labor organizations. In fact, UAW and the Ohio AFL-CIO have written letters in support of restoring benefits for the Delphi Sauer retirees. They see also the injustice that was done here. I've worked alongside many members of my community and members of Congress to advocate on behalf of both the union and non-union labor to ensure that all retirees receive whatever benefits they were promised. All of the retirees, regardless of labor affiliation or not, worked alongside each other during their careers. And Mr. Chairman, there were also other unions that did not receive the full benefits and that were penalized in this process. They should not be treated any differently in their retirement. Mr. Chairman, your assistance in bringing to light what occurred, what transpired in the administration picking winners and losers is what will assist us in being able to set aside this injustice. No administration should be able to take taxpayers' dollars and pick winners and losers, and also at the same time refuse to tell the country what they did with the money, what their justification and rationale was, and be free, and they should also not be free from our oversight and review, and certainly from the legal processes. To this date, the administration has continued to try to thwart the lawsuit that has been filed by the Delphi Sauer retirees, resisting requests for production of documents and discovery requests, and they have also resisted congressional oversight, as we have requested documents. It should not take years for us to find out basically 2 questions: what happened and why? So that we can then, both through a legal basis and through a congressional basis, review the decisions that were made and the effects on the people that are here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for being here for this hearing, and thank you for your commitment to what truly is a great injustice. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you again, Mr. Turner, and we'll now turn to our first panel. We have two panels of witnesses. First, Mr. Turner asked that members may have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record without objection, so ordered. And now, as I welcome the witnesses, let me introduce them publicly. First, Mr. Bruce Gump is a member of the Delphi Salaried Retirees Association. Ms. Mary Miller is a member of the Delphi Salaried Retirees Association. Mr. Tom Rose, also a member of the Delphi Salaried Retirees Association. As you have heard previously, this is an investigative panel of Congress, chief investigative panel. So we do, pursuant to our committee rules, swear in all of our witnesses. So if you'll please stand, rise, raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the Subcommittee of Congress is the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
We'll let the record reflect that all three witnesses answered in the affirmative, and we'll start with Mr. Gump. Recognize you. Let me just tell all of the witnesses, I'd like you to try to limit your remarks before the subcommittee to 5 minutes. If you have additional data, information, or something you'd like included in the record, if you'd request that submission through the chair, we'll include it in the official testimony and transcript of today's hearing. So, Mr. Gump, welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Micah and Congressman Turner, and thank you for this opportunity. As you said, my name is Bruce Gump, and I worked for General Motors for more than 22 years, and then Delphi for 10 years as a senior engineer. I worked hard, and I played by the rules. Like many others who made General Motors and Delphi able to exist by working in thousands of salaried positions, we didn't expect to be treated like yesterday's garbage by our government. I'd like to tell you what really happened because of the intervention of our government. When the President's Auto Task Force was formed, it quickly decided that in order for General Motors to be successful, it needed to secure General Motors' supply of critical parts from bankrupt Delphi. So they looked at the roadblocks and worked quickly to eliminate them. Up to that point, everyone involved knew that there would be no way to resolve the Delphi situation without addressing the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation's liens and claims that had been placed on Delphi's assets. These liens and claims were worth billions, and they ensured that Delphi and GM could not walk away from their long-standing pension obligations. But then the Auto Task Force was formed and took over the job of facilitating a resolution to the pension issues. They killed any hope we had of the PBGC looking out for our interests. The Auto Task Force has testified that the Treasury was, quote, trying to facilitate an agreement where the salaried plan would get terminated and taken over by the PBGC, end quote. And not surprisingly, that is exactly what happened. The shame of it is that the termination was entirely unnecessary. The plan was well-funded, and there were alternate sponsors available. Just a few weeks prior to the termination of the salaried pension plan, the plan's actuary completed an AFTAP analysis that determined the plan was about 86% funded, better than average at that time. The bottom line is that our plan and the liens and claims that protected it were simply in the way of the President's Auto Task Force. They were in a hurry, so they found a way to just kill the plan as quickly and efficiently as possible. While there's ample evidence in the form of emails and testimony to show how deeply responsible a select few in Treasury were for our situation, one need look no further than Vice President Biden's own words. In an interview with a Youngstown, Ohio television reporter on the subject, he said, "We were able to protect the hourly workers. Some salaried workers got hurt, particularly the younger ones." The "we" in that sentence refers to the administration of which he is a member, and confirms that the Auto Task Force under the U.S. Treasury was deeply involved in the decision to protect the hourly workers, but not the salaried workers. Also, the PBGC and Treasury have worked tirelessly to keep the records of their actions secret. If they were really proud and nothing inappropriate was done, they wouldn't have to work so hard to keep secrets. There have been numerous roadblocks thrown up to stop our attempts to gain understanding and justice. PBGC's so-called administrative record was found to be incomplete, to say it kindly. PBGC refused to comply with discovery for nearly 2 years and finally did after the federal court issued 5 additional orders. PBGC was ordered to fully comply with our discovery demands within 90 days, but they took all 90 to supply the very first documents and then continued only in dribs and drabs. 30,000 documents are still missing. PBGC offered misleading testimony while under oath about providing the administrative record. 70,000 documents not included in the original record have now been obtained. The PBGC simply has no credibility. PBGC has refused to supply non-personally identifiable census information as required in discovery. Congressional attempts to gain access to documents have been met with a shameful disregard and a threat to claim executive privilege over a pension issue. That's, to me, a tacit admission of guilt. Treasury tried to stymie the SIGTARPS investigation, and in fact, it took a special hearing to gain access to the principals in the President's Auto Task Force. The administration and the PBGC have misrepresented their actions and misled this committee for nearly 4 years now. It is time to bring this to an end and do what should have been done to begin with and restore the full pensions that we earned over decades of service. Finally, there's the economic impact of the decisions that left the salary retirees without their full pensions and no health care insurance. According to an extended Youngstown State University study, the cost to Ohio in terms of economic activity was nearly $500 million per year, and nearly 15,000 additional jobs were lost. Much of that can be recovered by restoring the pensions of the retirees. In summary, what really happened is very different from what the PBGC and Treasury have said. We're still trying to learn more, and we won't ever give up. But all we really want is what we earned, just as was provided to our coworkers. Real people are suffering because of this illegal and unethical treatment by our government. At the end of the day, the decisions to terminate our plan were made, vetted, encouraged, and determined by the President's Auto Task Force. They played God, and they played with people's lives, and they purposely hurt tens of thousands of American citizens in the process. Please help us force transparency into this issue by pursuing the records from Treasury and PBGC. Hold them accountable for their actions, good or bad. Show that American citizens deserve to be treated equally regardless of who they associate with or what groups or clubs they belong to. Help the administration to live up to its promises of transparency and pension protection, and help us gain the pensions we earned and help the economy to recover more quickly. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and now we'll turn and recognize to Mary Miller. Welcome, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Congressman, for inviting me to testify today. My name is Mary Miller. In 1999, General Motors decided to spin off their component parts business. This spin-off became Delphi Corporation. Delphi Corporation, the largest automotive parts supplier in the world, was integral to GM's success. Most Delphi retirees worked 2/3 or more of their careers in service to GM, and only a small part of their careers for Delphi. I worked 22 years for General Motors and only 9 for Delphi. I was forced to retire in 2008 when Delphi decided to permanently close its brake operations, where I worked as an HR manager. All GM salaried retirees are receiving their full pensions. All GM hourly retirees are receiving their full pensions. And all Delphi hourly retirees of major unions are receiving their full pensions. So what brings us together this morning if all of these retirees are receiving their full pensions? We're here today because one key group who works side by side with all these other people is not receiving their full pensions. The Delphi salaried retirees' pensions were decimated in 2009 during the Auto Task Force rush to settle GM's bankruptcy. The Delphi salaried retirees lost up to 70%. That's 70% of our hard-earned pensions. This loss has been devastating for our salaried retirees and their families. Congressman, this has caused home foreclosures, bankruptcies, family breakups, suicides, serious stress-related illnesses, and an ongoing struggle just to pay routine bills. How can it be legal for the government to pick winners and losers amongst its own citizens? For me and many of my fellow retirees, the burden of trying to figure out how to make ends meet gets heavier every day. We are real people. We suffer real hardships. And all the while, many of our neighbors with whom we worked side by side are receiving their full pensions. The Delphi hourly retirees of major unions are receiving every pension dollar they earned. The American taxpayers are paying for top-ups for all of the Delphi hourly retirees of major unions, top-ups that were won during the GM bankruptcy by politically connected individuals. The PBGC was created to help save retirement plans, and really, that is what I believe it tries to do. Just look at its efforts in the recent cases of American Airlines and Tower Automotive. What was different in our case? What was unique about our salaried pensions that allowed the PBGC to do nothing to defend and protect our pensions, pensions that were well-funded and very savable? We've heard over and over how proud the administration is of the Auto Task Force efforts to save automotive jobs in America. We've heard time after time how everything the Auto Task Force, the Treasury, and the PBGC did to help preserve those jobs was done normally and within the law. So, if they're so proud of everything they've done, then why are they so secretive about giving us the records we've been asking for since 2010? They have thwarted us at every turn, denying our requests for documents, not complying with our subpoena for their records, and even going to a different court to quash the subpoena. It really makes you eager to know what they are so desperate to hide that the White House attorney indicated they would use executive privilege to keep from revealing their records if subpoenaed. Congressman, this is from the same administration that promised, and I quote, "Transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency," end of quote. The PBGC has stonewalled every request we've made. The Treasury has been downright non-participative regarding every record we've asked them to provide. The House Ways and Means Committee asked for Treasury records last fall. None have been provided to date. We are asking the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee to obtain the Treasury's records so the truth about our case can finally be uncovered. While we will never give up our fight, we do need your help to win. We need our congressional representatives to be our advocates, to be on our side, to use your power given to make our government truly one of checks and balances, to demand this blatant wrong be righted immediately. Not later this year, not next year, not sometime in the future, but now. This fight has been going on for almost 4 years. It's time to end this disparate treatment and settle this shameful wrong while most of our retirees are still alive. Some are not. This can be done today with no cost to the taxpayers. The funds the PBGC receive for our salaried pensions are more than enough to make our pensions whole. Please join us in our brave fight to win back what is rightfully ours. Don't let any more time slip by without pressing our case forward to resolve this shameful, shameful violation of ERISA law. Help us move from being victims to victors. Reassure us and millions of others that this is still America, the land of the free and the home of the brave. We need your help. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll turn now to Mr. Tom Rose. Mr. Rose, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Micah and Congressman Turner, for holding this important hearing. Delphi salaried retirees continue to seek the truth about our pension termination, a termination that was absolutely unnecessary and, we believe, illegal. Yes, we believe the PBGC broke the law. My name is Tom Rose. After college and 2 years of military service, including a year in Vietnam, my automotive career began with GM and continued for 30 years. I spent an additional 9 years with Delphi. I certainly felt that I contributed a small piece to the powerful GM that had to be bailed out in 2009. I also expected to receive my health care and pension that was earned and promised as part of my employment. After the dust of the frantic 44-day GM bankruptcy had settled, I found myself with zero health care and, in my case, a 40% pension reduction. My carefully planned retirement was blown apart at a point in my life when recovery time and opportunities are limited. I look back and wonder what I did wrong. I now realize that I first trusted GM Delphi, and then I trusted the Auto Task Force that guided the bailout under the direction of Treasury. In the end, this trust was misplaced as myself and 20,000 other Delphi salaried retirees were abandoned. We are glad that the union retirees have their full health care and pensions. They earned it, and they deserve it, but so do we. They receive their full pensions, not from obsolete union contracts as alleged, but were topped up per direction of the Auto Task Force. As Mr. Gump stated from Vice President Biden, we were able to protect the hourly workers. Some salaried workers got hurt, particularly the younger ones. Speaking for myself, I simply fail to understand how two groups of employees working for the same company in the identical situation could be treated so distinctly different by our own government. The preferential treatment given the union is blatantly obvious. Were salaried workers wrong to expect fair and equitable treatment from our own government? Matthew Feldman, a member of the Auto Task Force, stated, "We were trying to facilitate an agreement where the salaried pension plan would get terminated and taken over by the PBGC, and GM would assume liability for the hourly plans. They were certainly successful in terminating our pension, in spite of the fact that our plan was considered to be fully funded by third-party actuaries. They were also successful in having the taxpayers pick up the tab to fully fund hourly pensions. This reinforces my belief that Treasury and the Auto Task Force were calling the shots, and the PBGC was simply a pawn in our pension termination. The PBGC's role is to, quote, protect the retirement income of pension plan beneficiaries. Let me recap how they have protected us. The PBGC's administrative record, which should clarify what happened, only serves to interject confusion. Despite the PBGC acknowledging almost daily coordination with the Auto Task Force, the administrative record was almost entirely stripped of references to this coordination. FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests to obtain information were answered by providing hundreds of pages of redacted material or simply withholding information. Again, this obscured the details of PBGC's actions. DSRA's lawsuit was brought in September 2009, and after numerous objections, Judge Tarnow of the U.S. District Court for Eastern District of Michigan ordered discovery in 2010. The PBGC did not produce a single document until June 2012, and only then after the court issued another 5 orders explicitly stating our right to discovery. The last of these orders was issued in March 2012 with the requirement to be completed within 90 days. After 15 months, the PBGC has still not fully complied. Treasury has never participated in discovery. Why not? Isn't the current administration the alleged most open and transparent ever? I don't mean to be critical. After all, the DSRA consists of both Republicans and Democrats, but the huge disconnect between words and actions is shameful. As you know, the PBGC has already also stonewalled numerous congressional requests for information. And recently, the PBGC announced that final benefit determination for our pensions could not occur until 2015, thus forcing continued financial uncertainty on salaried retirees. So I ask, is this how the PBGC protects us? I could go on, but in summary, justice delayed is justice denied. Fortunately, there is some good news. A solution exists for the salaried pension plan. In recent meetings with Treasury and PBGC, a proposal has been presented that fully funds the salaried pension plan, both retroactively and going forward. This proposal can be implemented immediately and with zero taxpayer money required. This would also fulfill the political solution as suggested by Judge Tarnow. Congressman, today we are asking for your help in requiring Treasury and PBGC to end this harm that was needlessly inflicted upon this group of American citizens. After almost 4 years, 1 Senate hearing, 6 House hearings, continuous PBGC delays, and no Treasury participation, this has gone on long enough. A solution exists, and the time to implement this is now. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all three of our witnesses, and I'll start with some questions. First, tell me the Delphi Salaried Retirees Association, Mr. Gump, Mr. Rose, Mr. Miller, what's its genesis and how long has it been in existence?
The DSRA was formed at the time when Delphi was being pushed into bankruptcy. In the course of just 2 weeks, we went from being totally non-existent to being fully formed, incorporated as a nonprofit, represented in court with over 2,000 members.
Did you represent the salaried retirees in any of the discussions before TARP, the Auto Task Force, the Pension Guarantee Fund?
No, the only representation that we had was in the bankruptcy court, and that was really only over the healthcare issue.
Okay.
I should say that we were actually denied the opportunity to be represented during all the pension issues. Those meetings were
So
held behind closed doors.
no one represented your particular group, the salaried retirees, in these discussions? No formal group represented?
That's correct.
Were there any public hearings? I don't know, or
No.
Everything was done behind closed doors?
As far as the decisions to terminate the pensions, yes, all of that was made behind closed doors.
Okay. Mr. Rose, you just mentioned the solution, and I think Ms. Miller, you spoke about it. Ms. Miller, you said that there was enough funds that had been paid into the Pension Guarantee Fund to adequately compensate the affected salaries employees whose pensions were denied. Is that, how do you come up with that?
That's correct. And our attorneys were in the meeting with the Treasury and the PBGC recently and submitted a proposal.
And that's what Mr. Rose,
Yes, that
you
he
were
was talking about, that the proposal identifies.
So you could isolate the funds by, of course, you have the names and records. And we have, NSA probably has their phone numbers too. But, something.
Yeah, it was factually backed up. It wasn't just like a desire.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have approximately 20,000 salaried employees that were affected. Do you know the exact number or approximate?
I believe it's about 20,300.
About 20,300.
Yes.
It was interesting in reading some of the documentation. Most of them had worked for GM before and had pretty long histories of working with GM before working with Delphi. I'm sure that's also documentable, Ms. Miller.
Right. I mean, Delphi wasn't in existence till 1999, so
Okay.
anyone who would be eligible to retire had to have had a long career with GM before we were spun off into
So
Delphi.
actually, they got shafted even though they had been part of the principal parent company. Now, let's go back to the Pension Guarantee Fund issue. There was a report, what is this Towers-Watson report? When was that issued? Was that issued before they made their decision or after they made their decision?
Before they made a decision, and only just a couple of weeks before.
Okay.
Right? So it was a very
And
fresh report.
is that the report that also said that it was 86% funded? I think you were.
That's correct.
And I think historically that many plans that were terminated performed far worse than that. In fact, that was a pretty high funding and performance level.
It was better than the average of the top 100 largest plans in America at the time. Right? That average was about 84%. So
Okay.
the Delphi plan was actually well funded. And remember, we were at the very trough, the very bottom of a major recession. So almost every plan in America was underfunded at the time.
So everyone believes then it was just an arbitrary decision that was either we don't know, but forced on the Pension Guarantee Fund to in this matter.
The
Mr.
average funding level of the top 100 plans was 84%, as Bruce suggested. None of those top 100 plans were terminated, yet ours was
Right.
terminated at 86%.
So basically a political decision and just excluding a class which happened to be the salaried workers.
Chairman Micah, one of the concerns we have, and the reason that we need the census information, is to understand how it is that PBGC determined that our plan was only 46% funded. Somehow they modified the liabilities of the plan to make it appear as though it was much worse funded than it really was.
Well, I was also appalled by the record of failure to respond both to our committee, to the courts, and the courts had some pretty specific directives. I think you cited those in which they still haven't complied. Not just our committee. Mr. Turner had confirmed that Ways and Means had also, because they oversee Treasury, had been denied the information. And the Freedom of Information requests, now were those made by your group, again, the Delphi salaried retirees?
Yes.
Okay. And most of what you got, you said, was redacted or not germane?
Yes, heavily redacted or simply not supplied. Some emails were "Dear so-and-so," blacked out completely, sincerely.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that seems to be what we've run into. I've been on I'm the most senior member of the panel. My seniority is greater than even Mr. Issa. And so I've seen a lot in my 21 years. I've never seen an era in which they have denied at least the rightful committees of Congress information. Our committee, as you know, we had to hold the Attorney General in contempt. We still don't have the rightful information we're entitled to. We are now still in court even after he was held in contempt to get that. I talked to Mr. Turner last night and staff, and we're going to go back. I'll go back and have discussions with Mr. Issa. If necessary, we'll see if the subcommittee can issue subpoenas for the information. The other thing, too, is we've held so far Mr. Holder in contempt. It may be necessary to go after additional folks in different agencies. We've got TARP, we've got the Auto Task Force, the Pension Guarantee Fund, Treasury, maybe even the United Auto Workers. Does anyone know if any of the other union groups were in communication on a resolution of their part of the pension settlement?
UAW was in fact a part of the discussions that happened in Poughkeepsie, New York during the auto bailout. The negotiations that happened
And you
between...
weren't invited to
We were not
Poughkeepsie?
invited.
Who else was in Poughkeepsie? There were two other smaller unions?
Treasury, PBGC, General Motors, Delphi, and UAW are all that I'm aware of.
Afterwards, the IUE.
I'm sorry?
Right. The IUE and the steel workers had separate negotiations that resulted in the top-ups. It should be clear, by the way.
Now,
and I noted
they
that-
were separate from Poughkeepsie?
Yes, separate from the Poughkeepsie meeting. But I want to make clear, too, that new General Motors was under no obligation to those old contracts. They were held by the bankruptcy court to not be liable to those old contracts. Those old contracts do still exist, but they're with old GM, not new GM. And yet it's new GM that's topping up the pensions. Supposedly, new GM chose to pay $1 billion for the, to top up the pensions for the IUE and the steel workers. Excuse me. So, you know, those negotiations happened separately, right, not as a part of the bankruptcy process and certainly not as a result of contracts.
It's estimated it's going to take, well, they're going to spend about $20 billion on, well, that'll be the loss to the government on this to correct the pension situation. How how much additional would it cost to cover the salaried employees?
Nothing. It'll cost the government nothing. The money is
And
available
you
at the
base that
PBGC.
on the money that's been paid into
That's
the
correct.
fund?
There was a waterfall fund. What happened was is that in order to get the agreement of the PBGC to abandon the only tool that ERISA really allows them, and that's to file liens and claims against assets of the company, they abandoned those in exchange for stock in new Delphi. Now, that company didn't even exist when they made that deal, all right, but over time, it did actually work out, and Delphi was able to purchase back that stock for about 3 times the original value. So that was the waterfall fund. However, those liens and claims were sort of like the key to the car. You know, you might buy a car for $20, but you can't drive it without the key, so what's the value of the key? That was what the liens and claims were. And Delphi's foreign assets that the claims were against were worth between $3 and $4 billion at the time, and they couldn't dispose of them until those liens and claims were disposed of. So Treasury was in a hurry. There was no time to get this done in any other way, so they simply terminated the plan and got PBGC to accept stock in a non-existent company at the moment in order to get them to agree to abandon their claims.
How much of it you had to spend, Mr. Rose, so far in legal pursuit to the,
Delphi salaried retirees, after paying increased health care costs from reduced pension dollars, have contributed $3.8 million to our council, who is doing an excellent job for us. In addition, the government has spent $2 million defending the lawsuit of our own taxpayer money. All of this for something that didn't need to happen.
Just to clarify, if you don't mind, that $2 million is how much they paid an outside law firm. Their own internal expenses, we don't know what they
on
are.
top of that?
Yes.
Well, again, this is very frustrating. I can imagine your frustration being ignored. Sometimes in Congress, we do have a change in various leadership of committees and panels, but I've taken this on and will pursue it, and I think we'll look at any avenue we can to work with your group and try to, again, ascertain the facts. It's deplorable that these agencies of government would be so non-responsive both to Congress and the courts, and that we would also, again, this is a huge amount of taxpayer money. I've heard, as I think maybe Ms. Miller testified, everybody's boasting about the success of the bailout, and everyone's forgotten 20,000 plus salaried retirees that got left behind in this whole process and now are ignored even in simple discovery of the facts. So we'll crank it up and pursue it. Are there any other suggestions as to how we might? I've got likely suspects. How we might get information from others. Any other entities or agencies or individuals that might be good to haul before us?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, and we'd be happy to work with you, outside of this to identify those people.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you for your testimony. Let me yield now to Mr. Turner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. Thank you for your dedication to the details of this issue and for your understanding both the personal impacts and the fact that our government shouldn't work this way. That this is an injustice that no one should have to withstand. Mr. Rose, you indicated, excuse me, that the government had spent $2 million on outside counsel in defending the lawsuit. I want to correct that a little bit. They've been spending $2 million on outside counsel to stop you from getting documents for you to go forward with the agreement, because no one's been defending the lawsuit because the lawsuit's not moving because they won't even come forward. You mentioned the redacted emails. With your approval, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record these examples that I have. We have the first one that says, here is Skaden's latest draft of the agreement, and then it says 6 lines removed, deleted, so we don't get anything on the agreement. The next one, Draft PBGC settlement agreement, 7 lines removed. Regards, Allison. This is one that has no text of the email. The next one, 20 pages of the email are deleted. Next one, government pre-essential attachment deleted. This one, I like this one because it says, Ron, a few items from our phone conversation this morning about the proposed Delphi PBGC settlement agreement. And then it says, 10 lines removed. Then it says, please call me if you have any questions, John. We have a few questions and we'll be calling John. The next one, deleted, 34 pages. After this, the next one deleted 17 pages. The next one deleted 4 pages. All of these show that there's no substance to these emails that are
Will the
released.
gentleman yield?
Yes.
So some of these individuals might have information. Have any of them been hauled before our committee?
A few of them have come before when they refused to testify before SIGTARP, the independent journal, the independent review for the excuse me, I have a cold, expenditures of TARP. We held a hearing solely on the question of why aren't you answering the questions? We're not able to go farther into the substance of what their answers would be.
Okay. Well, I'd like to sort through them, and the ones who haven't had the privilege or opportunity, maybe we can hold them in. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate.
Without objection, this will be made part of the record.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, as you described with respect to this process, when Delphi and General Motors went into bankruptcy, of the umbrella of TARP, we had banks, we had bondholders, we had the PBGC, we had General Motors, we had unions and general creditors. What usually happens in a bankruptcy is that each of those parties are independent. They're brought before the court, and the court expects that each of them are going to have the rights of the people that they represent. But in this instance, because TARP was put in place, the government had become the banks, the government had become the bondholders, the government was PBGC, the government acquired General Motors. Due to political connections, there was a close relationship between the administration and unions, and other creditors were pushed aside, and certainly the Delphi salary retirees were pushed aside. Mr. Rose, I'd like to ask you a question about that. Federal law established that PBGC is supposed to be an independent agency. But when it came to the General Motors bailout, PBGC really stopped being an independent agency, and I believe you have some comments and would bolster that. But also Vince Snowbarger, who came before us, talked initially about that all these parties were acting independently. None of us believed that. He is now retired, and I believe he's appeared in your litigation. Is there any additional information we have about that so-called independence between all those parties that basically became Timothy Geithner?
Well, contrary to Mr. Snowbarger's testimony before the prior hearing here in Dayton, and since then he has retired and been deposed by our attorneys, and it was stated there was no conflict in the PBGC's role, and actually I think we found out just the opposite. Certainly Tim Geithner, for example, had a triple role in this entire termination. Is obviously Treasury, the Secretary of Treasury, Chief Lender to GM, certainly the head of the auto task force that was driving this, and he's also on the PBGC board. So there was a tremendous conflict of interest.
Now, Mr. Rose, part of the reason why everyone is so upset about this is because this should be a relatively easy review process. We're dealing with issues of math and law. What does the math say, and what laws apply? Unfortunately, the answers that we frequently get throughout this process are subjective of what people think that the numbers are or what they think should have been done, not issues of what is the math and what is the law. Our effort is, of course, to get the information and data, apply math, and apply the law, and determine what occurred and whether or not your rights were violated, as I believe they were, and where the monies were and how they should be put back. You mentioned delays in final benefit determinations. What does that mean for you? And in a practical sense, does it mean that you have to continue to receive your pension under its current reduction? As you go to 2015, we're still dealing with math and law, but they're not even giving you answers for the future, right?
That's correct. What they've given us right now is a preliminary pension, okay? Well, it's very preliminary, and they have to say they have to do calculations to perform a final determination. We're all living, with financial hardships. In many cases, salaried retirees are living below federal poverty level guidelines. And now, it would be until 2015, 6 years after termination, that we're forced to live under continued financial uncertainty.
So one of the issues we get at the bottom of, it's not just that they won't tell us the math and the law for how they decided to terminate the pension, take over the pension, and give you the numbers of your reduction. They still aren't even telling you the math and the law for what the future is. And that's
correct.
part of, obviously, what we need to do, and I know that your lawyers are pursuing. Ms. Miller, you talked passionately about the difficult struggles that retirees have had. Could you tell us a little about your own story?
Well, I think the biggest thing for me has been the loss of health care. When I retired from Delphi, I expected at that time to pay about $200 a month for myself and my children that are still in school, in college. And now to cover myself and my boys, it's $2,300 a month. I can't do that on my, on a reduced pension. I mean, it's impossible. And, to not have health care after all these years of being able to provide that for my family really makes me feel, that I have let them down. And it gives me great worry about, what might happen to them. So that's with me every day.
Mr. Gump, the chairman was saying that when we had these emails that were released to the committee, but they're redacted, so they're worthless on their face. The committee had called forward these individuals when they had refused to answer questions to SIGTARP, the Special Inspector General, and our focus then was to get them to comply with the answers. But they still haven't answered you. So what tools do you think are needed to ensure that the administration responds completely and effectively? Does the law need to be changed, or is it just that the law needs to be enforced?
I think the law needs to be enforced. The laws are in place to prevent this and to have the ability to know what happened and why. The issue here is that these people acted behind closed doors in a very rapid manner, and they cut some corners, and they knew that they did it. They even have some conversations about that. But they don't want us to know that they knew that they were doing it, because that would call into question how they acted at all. PBGC tried to follow a very rapid termination plan, and a plan that wasn't necessary to be terminated at all. So they had to manipulate the numbers. They won't let us know how they did that. They've had to follow a certain process, an involuntary termination process, that required them to meet certain criteria that were not met. So they had to manipulate the plan to make it appear as though it met that criteria. So there's a number of pieces here that should be available to us, and the tools to get to them do exist. We simply need to enforce those rules. Issuing a subpoena to force them to give up the information would be one that we would be very grateful for. We have tried to issue our own subpoena, and Treasury simply moved to quash it. So assistance to gain access to those records, which do exist, would be very helpful.
Mr. Chairman, when we called the members of the Auto Task Force forward to the Government Reform Subcommittee to ask them why they were not answering SIGTARP, the Independent General Counsel, they said, well, we're not in government anymore. We shouldn't have to answer any questions about what we did when we were in government. Well, that's not how our government works. and I appreciate your commitment to that. And with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you. Again, I want to just ask one question on the amount of money that's estimated to make this whole. Is there an estimate? Ms. Miller, you mentioned that the Pension Guarantee Fund that these folks had paid into, and with 20,000 folks, most of them 20 years or more, paying into it before it was terminated, that would have been a sizable contribution.
Certainly, there are estimates of that. The AFTAP analysis that was done prior, it gives us some background. We need to have census information in order to have a fully accurate. But I want you to consider the fact that PBGC has agreed that the assets of the plan at the time of termination were about $2.3 billion. And based on their own published return on investment numbers, those assets should be something over $4 billion now. So there's more than enough money in the plan already to fully fund it, especially when you add into it the income from the waterfall and other sources that were there.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I think Mr. Turner pointed out that all these actions were government agencies, and I'm stunned to find out that you were totally excluded. That's my understanding from any of the negotiations at Poughkeepsie with Auto Task Force, TARP, Treasury never had an opportunity to participate, while some of the others did in fact, and also did benefit, which, and now the fact that we are finding it almost impossible through Congress or congressional efforts to date and the courts to date to obtain information on how all this came down. Well, as I said, we will see about our ability to issue subpoenas and consult with Mr. Issa when we return. And then I think I'd like to also call in some of these folks from some of the information you've gotten that's been redacted and that I've seen here submitted, and see if we can't get them to tell us the rest of the story. We'll haul in those who haven't been hauled in, and go back to the agency. So sometimes in Washington I've found that you can be very powerful and you can be very well placed, you can be very financially well off, but you just have to be a persistent bastard to get things done.
I don't know if I should be offended or not.
Well, the worst combination for the offenders in this case is they have two very persistent bastards. Well, we made a little light here at the end, but this is a very serious matter, and it boils down to the basic fairness of government and how it treats people, and also the use of taxpayer money. I did not vote for TARP. I didn't vote for the bailout. It's just I come from a business background, and I just have not followed that course. I did arrange for, as chairman of aviation, to assist the airlines with a loan guarantee fund, of which every penny was paid back, and we made about $1/3 of $1 billion after 9/11, and actually consulted, because there were several TARP proposals that were absolutely horrible, and but I couldn't support it in the end. Nonetheless, this has transpired, and nonetheless, people's lives have been dramatically, unfairly impacted, and the government was responsible for all of this, using government funds and government agencies to make the decisions that have led to this unfairness. So I think what we'll do is thank you for testifying, coming before the committee, keeping this open, and pursuing it, what your association has done on behalf of the salary employees. We'll excuse you at this time, and if we may, in the next 7 days, have additional questions, we'll submit to you, and they will be made part of the record. So thank you again for your participation. I'm going to call up the second panel, and we'll excuse, again, Mr. Gump, Ms. Miller, Mr. Rose, and we'll ask staff to go ahead and I'm not going to recess. I want to go ahead and pursue the witnesses, so we'll ask them to come up. People have to excuse themselves briefly. Do that. We have two additional witnesses, and let me introduce them as they come up and take their seat. One is Mr. Paul Du Bois, as a member of the Delphi Salaried Retirees Association. Second witness is Mr. James Shirk, and he is a senior policy analyst in labor economics at the Heritage Foundation. As I mentioned before to our previous witnesses, this is a chief investigative panel in Congress. Our committee and the subcommittee will swear you in just a minute. Also advise you that we'd like you to keep your remarks to approximately 5 minutes, and then through request of the chair, glad to submit additional information or data, any requests you have through the chair into the official record. So with that, we do have Mr. Du Bois and Mr. Shirk. Welcome. I will ask you, pursuant to committee rules, to stand, sworn in. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this subcommittee of Congress is the whole truth and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Witnesses, the record will reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative, and I welcome you again. Pleased to have you with us this morning. We'll recognize Mr. Du Bois first, and hope I pronounced it right. Close?
Not quite, but it'll do.
Okay, tell me.
It's actually a Polish name. It's pronounced Dobash.
Dobash, okay.
But
I'm married
but no one gets it right, so I don't worry about it.
I'm married.
When I was in college, I'd hear people say my name. I'd just sort of snake my hand up and say here the first time they called the roll.
Well, I'm married to half Polish. In fact, her maiden name's Szymanek, S-Z-Y. You got the S-Z on the end. Well, Mr. Dobash, you're recognized and welcome.
Okay. Chairman Micah, Congressman Turner, thank you for the opportunity to address you on a matter that has profoundly altered the lives and financial futures of over 20,000 Delphi salaried employees, retirees, and their families. I'm a retired Delphi engineer who served those companies loyally for 37 years. The last 9 of those years of employment were with Delphi. Like my colleague Bruce Gump, I've received Delphi's highest engineering honors for numerous patents and other intellectual property contributions that helped make Delphi a technology leader and enabled the company to win nearly $500 million in new business. At the time I retired in December of 2008, my wife and I had carefully planned for financial self-sufficiency with a retirement plan built around a 3-legged stool of personal savings, my Delphi pension, and then someday Social Security benefits. I never imagined that just 7 months later, I would see that stool kicked out from under me by federal government institutions charged with defending and preserving pension plans such as mine. As I sat in the courtroom of federal judge Arthur Tarnow, I could scarcely believe my ears as I heard the PBGC's attorney tell the judge it was the obligation of the PBGC to protect the PBGC and its assets. When Judge Tarnow asked him, well, who's looking out after the interests of the pensioners, the attorney was speechless. In the short time that I have to address you this morning, I'd like to share how unnecessary the termination of our already frozen pension plan was, especially in light of actuarial data the PBGC had in hand concerning the assets and liabilities of our plan. The salaried pension plan had already been frozen in October of 2008. That meant it was no longer accruing any liabilities. The plan had also been closed to new hires since January of 2001. Those new employees received a defined contribution benefit in its place. The PBGC was acutely aware that the economy was in a trough and that the financial markets were in the beginning stages of a recovery. The decreased valuation of the plan's assets represented a snapshot in time rather than a realistic determination of their ability to pay benefits and the long-term viability. At the time of the termination, the Dow was hovering around 9,000. But 4 years later, the Dow is now at 15,000, an increase of 67%. A market recovery of that proportion has grown the value of the plan's assets, but unfortunately for retirees, that makes no difference because the PBGC's valuation of those assets for the purpose of benefit computations is frozen in time at July 2009 numbers. Well, that raises an obvious question. If the Delphi salaried plan's assets were merely experiencing the effects of a dip in the financial markets, why was the PBGC so agreeable to terminating a plan to its own potential financial detriment? The answer to that question lies in political influence. Delphi's hedge fund, debtor-in-possession lenders, and other politically influential players in the GM bailout were able to exert that force on the PBGC via the U.S. Treasury and the Auto Task Force to clear all pension liabilities from Delphi's balance sheet. With the knowledge we've gained from discovery, we now know that despite the public insistence that the Delphi salaried plans were severely underfunded, the PBGC's own internal analysis of potential scenarios to preserve the Delphi salaried plan showed that very modest additional funding would have been required to fully meet the plan's obligations. Actuarial reports in the PBGC's possession showed the real asset to liability ratio at 75%, or as previously mentioned, 86%, utilizing even some pessimistic economic assumptions. Meanwhile, the PBGC continued to justify that termination by citing asset to liability ratios around 46%. Independent actuaries who benchmarked the Delphi salaried plan against peer plans that they had deemed adequately funded judged that the Delphi salaried plan funding was at least on a par with those plans. All of that uncertainty and conflicting numbers continues to hang over the heads of retirees who 4 years after plan termination are still waiting for accurate accounting of assets and liabilities seized by the PBGC, and most importantly, their final PBGC benefit amount. In response to an inquiry by Congressman Turner, the PBGC recently stated that they're unlikely to have this task completed anytime soon, in fact, before 2015. Now, that's 6 years after the termination took place. In my mind, there's no credible excuse for taking 6 years to account for assets and liabilities and compute benefit amounts according to a set formula. Now, I could dive deeper into what we've learned in this arduous 4-year battle to recover our pensions that were seized to benefit politically powerful, but time severely limits how much I can share in this forum. Delphi salaried retirees aren't asking for a handout. We're asking for our government to behave in an open and honest manner and to comply with laws and regulations without regard to political influence or power. This issue may not garner very widespread attention in front-page headlines like the IRS scandals currently are, but it represents an equally blatant abuse of political power. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the committee.
Well, thank you. Now we'll turn to Mr. Shirk, and he's affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, but appears testifying on his own behalf today as a result of his review of this matter. Welcome, sir, and you're recognized.
Chairman Mica and Congressman Turner, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is James Shirk, and I'm a senior policy analyst in labor economics at the Heritage Foundation. But as you said, the views I express in this testimony are my own. It should not be construed as an official position of the Heritage Foundation. This morning, I want to explain that the United Auto Workers received unusual preferential treatment during the auto bailout, and that without this favoritism, the taxpayers would not have lost money. There are several important facts about the bailout for you to consider. The first fact is that the United Auto Workers received highly unusual preferential treatment. Bankruptcy law gives the courts the authority to rewrite union contracts to make companies viable again. In a normal bankruptcy, union pay at General Motors and Chrysler would have been reduced to market rates. Instead, while the union did make significant sacrifices on behalf of new hires, incumbent workers retained most of their existing compensation packages. As the UAW put it, quote, "For our active members, these tentative changes mean no loss in your base hourly pay, no reduction in your health care, and no reduction in pensions." This rarely happens at unionized companies and bankruptcies. Bankruptcy law also provides for secured creditors to recover their claims before unsecured creditors, and for similarly situated unsecured creditors to receive similar treatment. This also did not happen. General Motors owed approximately $20 billion to a trust fund paying UAW retiree health benefits and $30 billion to its unsecured bondholders. These claims had the same legal priority. However, the union enjoyed a substantially greater recovery on its debts. For their $30 billion in claims, General Motors' unsecured bondholders received stocks and warrants worth, in present value, $8.7 billion. Had the UAW received equal treatment, it would have recovered the same proportion of its debts, about $5.9 billion. Instead, the union collected assets worth $20.4 billion, over 3 times as much. The same thing happened at Chrysler. Chrysler's first lien secured creditors collected $2 billion on their $6.9 billion in debt, 29 cents on the dollar. Chrysler's second lien secured creditors collected nothing. Legally, the UAW's claims had lower priority than both the first and the second lien secured creditors, so the union should have also received nothing until all the secured creditors were paid in full. Instead, the union got securities and ownership shares in New Chrysler worth, in today's dollars, present value, $9.7 billion. And as we've discussed today, UAW members also received special treatment at Delphi when it filed to have the PBGC take over its pensions plans. Half of the Delphi retirees, both salaried and hourly, faced reductions in their pensions. Now, old GM had an agreement with the unions to top up the pensions in case Delphi went bankrupt, but that was only a liability for old GM. New GM had no such liability. Instead, nonetheless, New GM's management, while being overseen by the Obama administration, supplemented the pensions of the unionized retirees at a cost of $1 billion. The non-union retirees, again, recovered nothing. The United Auto Workers received highly and unusual favorable treatment during the bailout and the bankruptcy. The second fact about the bailout to be aware of is that the automakers could have been kept in business without any of this favoritism. They could have produced the same number of cars and made as much money at much less cost to taxpayers. There was no business reason to provide this favoritism. The Obama administration's justification is that the United Auto Workers were essential to basically prevent them from striking. But in 2009, they had little leverage and had no plans whatsoever to go on strike. Even if the union had gone on strike, General Motors and Chrysler have had no difficulty filling their new Tier 2 positions that pay less than what the transplant automakers pay. The companies could have simply continued operations with replacement workers. There was no reason for this preferential treatment. Had the government treated the UAW in the manner required by bankruptcy law, the entire bailout would have amounted to subsidized loans instead of the bailout that they paid. The UAW's excess recovery did nothing to keep the automakers in business. The third fact is that this union favoritism caused the taxpayer losses on the bailout. The Congressional Budget Office and the Treasury Department estimate that taxpayers will lose between $17 billion and $20 billion on the bailout. These losses would not have occurred if the administration had given the UAW standard treatment in the bankruptcy. If the bankruptcy had reduced union compensation to market rates, GM's labor costs would have fallen, raising the value of the government's ownership in new GM. This would have saved taxpayers almost $5 billion. The Union Trust Fund's disproportionate recovery also came at taxpayer expense. The excess shares and securities that the union got could have gone to the Treasury and to the taxpayers instead. Not doing so cost taxpayers $14.5 billion at General Motors and almost $10 billion at Chrysler. And not giving the bailout to the hourly retirees at Delphi would have further reduced the cost of the bailout by $1 billion. In total, the UAW received $30 billion more than it would have under normal bankruptcy proceedings. The entire loss to the taxpayers comes from these funds diverted to the union. The administration could have kept the automakers running without losing a dime. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to explain how the unusual treatment given to the UAW caused the taxpayers to lose billions on the bailout of General Motors and Chrysler.
Thank you both for your testimony, and we'll turn to some questions now. Shirk, let me ask you a question. The pension guarantee fund was terminated for the salaried employees. Do you know if it was terminated for the hourly or kept in
My
place?
understanding, it was just terminated for both, but then the hourly employees received a top-up from New GM.
So, in other words, the top-up it would have had to come from taxpayer money because they were operating basically on the lifeline that was thrown to them by the federal government at the time.
Well, that's exactly right. New GM was a creation of the taxpayers. It was capitalized and created by the Treasury, and all the initial operating funds they had came from taxpayer funds.
Now, when we get through with this, I've seen that some stock has recently been sold. Slip of the tongue there, but some of the stock has been cashed in and at about $34, $35. It would have to be in the $50 range, I think, to break even.
That's right.
Okay.
If it had been sold at $50 right from the
Okay,
get-go.
but the total amount that taxpayers are going to end up paying, are you familiar with it? Is it now I heard the estimate is 17 to 20.
Yeah, it depends
Hard
on
to-
the taxpayers still have about 200 million shares of New GM, and it depends what price those are
But
sold
what
for.
price the balance is sold
Yeah.
at.
So
So a
it's
potential 15 to 20 billion dollars.
That's right.
Now, the other thing too is it looked like it says the topping up of the unionized retirees' pensions was about $1 billion, but the UAW got 30 billion in perks from the bailout. Can you explain how you calculate that?
That's right. There were three different sets of preferences they received. First was for the Union Retiree Medical Benefits Trust Fund, also called AVIBA, which had about $20 billion was owed to them at General Motors, and about
At the time of the bankruptcy.
at the time of the bankruptcy, and about $8 billion. And this was basically future claims brought into present value terms in 2009. And they should have recovered at the same rate as the unsecured creditors of both companies. Now, at General Motors, they recovered at about triple the rate of the unsecured creditors. And at Chrysler, the secured creditors weren't even paid off. They got 29 cents on the dollar, the first lane secured creditors. So the union should have also gotten nothing. And all those excess shares that the unions recovered could have gone to the taxpayers instead.
So you got the salaried employees, the secured, were they bondholders or?
It was, at General Motors, the secured creditors were made whole, but the unsecured creditors collected at a much lower rate than
Unsecured,
the union did.
okay.
And at Chrysler, the secured creditors got 29 cents on the dollar.
29 cents.
And the unsecured creditors got nothing.
And you said that's a huge liability on the healthcare side. Was that GM or?
It was for
and
both
Chrysler?
of them. It was $14.5 billion at General Motors was the excess recovery. It was about $20 billion was owed at General Motors, and about $8 billion was owed at Chrysler. And then the unions got shares and stocks in the company that became worth quite a lot of money and a lot more
The
than they should have.
breakdown of the 30 billion is mostly healthcare?
It's mostly healthcare, with so about $10 billion at Chrysler, $14.5 billion at GM for those healthcare costs.
How did the retirees find their healthcare situations, or was that were you completely taken out of the healthcare?
Yes, we received a notice in February of 2009 that as of April 1st, we would no longer have company-provided health care. At that point, we could buy it individually. In my case, for my wife and myself, it was $1,600 a month. Now, this was before the pension termination took place. we realized that this was a very non-viable situation, and so we organized a Voluntary Benefits Association, a VEBA, that was HCTC qualified. And now our retirees have access to that through the end of this calendar year until the new health care law takes effect. And that provides premium subsidies and brings the premiums down into, for a family, maybe $500 to $600. And I'm not familiar with the current numbers on that, but somewhere in that range as opposed to $1,600.
Well, okay, you saw your pensions cut, your health care eliminated. On the other side, the hourly...
Their health care is assured and their pensions are whole. It's a totally different treatment.
So they use taxpayer money also to underwrite that, and
That is correct.
The losses were staggering, or the indebtedness of the healthcare.
One of the
huge portion of that. Now, what happened with that? That was just written off also?
the healthcare portion.
Yeah, for the new GM, did they come out of this with no healthcare liability?
Yes, the unions actually became the healthcare providers for the retirees, and it was funded with this money that they received from the bailout.
So Pension Guarantee Fund, which was supposed to help you, did not help you. You had about $2.3 billion in assets at the time they threw you overboard, and you had this huge liability on health care, which was also absorbed by the taxpayer. So you got doubly shafted. Even if you got your retirement back, you're still shafted on the health care side.
Until our people are Medicare eligible, and we had a group of fairly young retirees because our demographics were such that as Delphi started closing a lot of operations, people were being pushed to either retire early or they had no other options.
Well, most of this effort has been to seek some justice in the pension, but the health care is actually, you've not been able to pursue. There's nothing to pursue there. You just got shafted, and the taxpayer money, which ironically you were paying the taxes all that time, ended up bailing out the incredible amount of money for health care that was due. So.
Yeah, and I do have to say the health coverage tax credit that we are eligible for has been a lifesaver for many of our people, because without it, they would be going naked without any coverage.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Shirk, you heard some of the testimony by the previous witnesses that again, the Pension Guarantee Fund acted arbitrarily, that in fact with 86%, I guess, of the assets available, they were still terminated. Do you see that as correct in their figures? Is there enough there to if they were treated fairly, and that still could be the case, to make whole their retirement?
I haven't had the opportunity to review those, the 86% figure. If that's true, that they were 86% funded when they were terminated, then very hard to see a justification for the termination. That there's a lot of funds, especially in 2009, that were terminated.
That were not
that were not terminated.
They're not even in that good a shape. Well, again, I think we need to get additional data. I was impressed with your report. I'll have to get this posted online. I guess you're releasing it today, your statement. It was you actually covered more than you did in your testimony, some 16 pages of background information, and it pretty in-depth. So we appreciate your providing that to the committee and your testimony. Let me yield to Mr. Turner.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for your statements on the issues of health care, because that is one that also illustrates the inequity. If you look at the issue that the healthcare tax credit that they've currently been utilizing is expiring with the Obamacare increases in premium that are expected and the pension reductions that each of these individuals have received. The financial impact on them is even greater as they look to what they may be facing in future costs for health insurance and health care. I know how this impacts families directly. My father was IUE from General Motors, not Delphi, in his retirement, but he was not UAW as a result in the bankruptcy of General Motors. He lost his health care after working for General Motors for over 40 years. Luckily, he was able to go on to my mother's retirement health insurance, but without that, we would have been facing a significant crisis, as many of these families are facing. They did face, of course, increased costs, but they would have had a crisis, as many of these families have struggled with. I appreciate your highlighting that, because that is absolutely a taxpayer-funded difference. Whenever you have an issue like this, where the government does something that doesn't make sense, and you try to do oversight, and the government doesn't respond to requests for documents and information, you become increasingly suspect. But another area where you can become increasingly suspect is if you call people forward and ask them questions, and the questions, their answers that they give you are disingenuous, where they're clearly misrepresentations. Mr. Chairman, we've had hearings where we have asked people, why was UAW topped up in the bankruptcy? And the answer has been to us, well, there was a pre-existing agreement between GM and the UAW for topping up the pensions. Now, we all know that, as Shirk was saying, one, that would have been with, under the bankruptcy, old GM, and that it was not binding in bankruptcy. And if you ask the next question in the hearing, yes, but this was a bankruptcy, wasn't that agreement voided? The testifier will say, yes, it was voided. But their initial answer to us, which is the disingenuous one, is, well, there was an agreement for it to be done. I was like each of you, if you could give us other examples that come to mind of answers that we've received that just don't make sense. Because when they tell you, one thing and you actually know another, I think it leads you to conclude that they're not telling the truth. And I know the frustrating process of lack of answers certainly gives a suspicion, but the